Uh, I would like to also welcome Concelor Hong, who has joined us from the commercial section of the Embassy of China, who has worked many years with companies here. You're very welcome, Concelor Hong. Maybe you would like to greet the webinar with some words, if possible. We don't hear you. You have to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Now we hear you. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. And unfortunately, Ambassador has some engagement in the afternoon, so he asked me to join you. And I want to be a good listener. And also, I wish to thank all the speakers for your excellent presentations. It's very interesting, and also shows the interest from Nordic countries about this BRI initiative. I do believe there is a great potential for our future cooperation. Actually, this morning I couldn't join the webinar because I have another web meeting with some Swedish friends in terms of eco-cities. It also shows that there are a lot of common interest from China and Sweden, and also from other Nordic countries in terms of cooperation. I do believe that with our joint efforts, we can facilitate and enhancing this cooperation. And also from the embassy, from my office, we will always stand by to provide any services as you need. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hong. You're very welcome. Glad you're with us.
Yes.
And I think that the next speaker, who will be joining us a bit later because of a engagement with her own webinar, Isabelle Hannouche, she I'm sure will be joining us probably within a short time, half an hour. In the meantime, what I would propose is that we can begin a kind of preliminary Q&A. I do want to point out that one second. I do want to point out that there has been some question raised from one of the participants about magnetically levitated trains, which could be built and financed, and raises the question of what the cost would be. I will let Mr. Alf Johansen answer that question. I can read it directly, but I think it's important to point out one point which my colleague was also speaking about in the morning session, Mr. Askari, that Mr. Sandmark could probably also elaborate on that there is a proposal to build these trains with concrete structures, levitated concrete structures, which can even be converted. This is what the Chinese are doing, that in the event that they go from fast trains to magnetically levitated trains, the ability to plan to be able to transform those constructions without having to rebuild everything from the beginning is an important part of economic planning in terms of modernization and development. But I can read the exact question if it would be possible to have, let's see, there are numbers of questions now actually coming in, but let me see if I can find the ones that, yes, Mr. Karl-Åke Utterström is asking everyone, why not maglev trains co-located with existing highway E18 for passenger traffic? in about with about 500 to 600 kilometers per hour, Oslo to Stockholm, about 1 hour. China, about Shanghai to Hangzhou, Ningbo, Kunming, and then he says a double maglev track will cost about 0.22 to 0.28 euros billion per, I think, kilometer is what he's saying. Until 2026, the Shanghai-Beijing maglev connection will be commercial. It will be in commercial use. Plan about 5,000 kilometers during the next 20 years. So maybe you would like to answer that after your presentation, Mr. Alf.
It should be through 10 kilometers.
I'm sorry, yeah, you can say what?
It should be through 10 kilometers.
Per 10 kilometer.
Swedish mil.
Okay, per 10 kilometers or 1 Swedish mile.
6 miles.
Well, I can just comment that personally, I'm not an expert on maglev. I have heard and read and seen videos, etc. However, for now, it seems like if we should go for the maglev system, it seems like we need more information, more experiences, more considerations. Let's say the more conventional high-speed railways are it's working everywhere, and it's not very vulnerable. I know there was some accident with the maglev system in Germany probably some years ago. I cannot rule out maglev, but as you say, Stephen, that if we build the concrete structure, it could also be used for maglev in the future. Because the concrete structure has to be put somewhere in the landscape, and for now that is a very important thing to see also how to build this big concrete structure. And if you put double track rails on it or maglev, I don't know. We will not rule it out, but for now that is not our plan. Thank you.
Okay. What about other people? If Mr. Sandmark, did you want to make a comment or have a question?
Yeah, I'm very thankful for what Alf said here about these projects he has, because what we see here is the kind of Norwegian part of proposal for the Nordic New Deal. The New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt was what is called the Four Corners project. It was to have one big project in each corner of the United States, and what we see here in Scandinavia with these kind of, if we put these projects together, like the tunnel in the south with Denmark and also Germany and Sweden, and then the tunnel on the other side and the Finnish side, then we have the Northern Railway projects, which was addressed by Ulf and Rönnberg. So in this way we have a possibility to complete that with the Norwegian part. So in this way we have the four corners here in Scandinavia also. Actually, Alf is covering quite a lot of the whole of Scandinavia. So in this way, if we bring it in a package now together, I think this is very important because this will create enough of dynamic to really lift this region to come out of the crisis which we have now, because we have a very, very bad crisis because of the aging population. We have all kinds of problems with housing. We have young people will have to work maybe 10 times more than our generation because they have so many problems to solve. We need this kind of new productivity in the infrastructure, and to raise it even to the level of, with the help of magnetic trains would even make it better. But what is important is that we raise the productivity in the Scandinavian nations here to be able to develop the welfare here and also make a contribution to the world.
Yeah, well, I think that's very important that we have this perspective of mobilizing the productive powers of labor, which are unfortunately to a great extent right now paralyzed, partly because of this corona pandemic, but in addition because of the false or incorrect policy which Mr. Askari was referring to in financing in the generally Western banking circles, much too much in terms of speculative investments and saving the debt structures which are not allowing credit to go into these types of highly productive forms of employment. So we have a situation where we could be, with just some of these projects that have been identified today, we could be employing more than the population we have in Sweden. When people speak about the so-called immigration problem, there would not be an immigration problem if one starts the kind of development perspective which would provide a circumstance where we would need more labor power and a better future, and putting people to productive work. So I think that's a very key concept, and I think maybe there might be some other inputs that other people have or questions.
Can I ask 2 questions?
Yes, you're welcome.
Okay. No, there's the usual criticism of the ideas for high-speed rail in Scandinavia. I don't agree with that criticism, but it has to be answered by the experts, because they say the population density in China, where the high-speed rail goes, because you have cities which are with populations in one city as much as all of Scandinavia. So the population density between the cities and between one point and the other on the high-speed lines in China are not the same as in Scandinavia, because we have much, much, much lower population density. So that makes the high-speed railway idea not profitable. The other question is, that's from my standpoint, is while the Belt and Road is, yes, it's connecting east and west. You can go from point A to point B very efficiently and with higher speed. But the question is that we consider these lines as development corridors. They're not only a railway which takes cargo from A to B, but it's important to consider what happens between point A and B. What happens to the regions between Oslo and Stockholm, or Oslo and Gothenburg, in terms of increased productivity and access to faster, what kind of industries can develop, what kind of economic activities can develop along the line, not simply on both ends of the line. So these 2 are my questions.
Do you have somebody you want to direct them to, or do you just want to put them on?
No, well, the high speed is to, I think, Alf, on the high speed and the population density, and then the others can answer, they can choose to answer.
Yeah, I can comment on this population issue. I mean, you shouldn't look at the overall population in the nation. You should look at the population at the concrete line we are talking about. And the commuting and the alternative ways of transportation. And if you have a high-speed railway that is much faster than a car on the short perspective, and even faster than a plane on some distances, and on longer distances, a good alternative to plane. Then you have many market segments. And we have a lot of commuting in and out of Oslo, in and out of Stockholm, and the same with Gothenburg, Copenhagen, Helsinki, etc. When you connect all these cities, it's not really so small. And you can say in Norway we fly more than anyone in the world. We have 10 times more air travels per capita than the average European. So even if Norway is a relatively small country, we have maybe 3-4 of the busiest air lines in Europe. For example, Oslo Trondheim, it's 2 million passengers. It's not really small. It's more than a lot of lines in routes in Europe where you have bigger cities. But because here the only alternative is going by plane, that's why we fly so much, and the price is high as well. So railways have it's a good market for fast railways, not for slow railways, but for fast railways.
Thank you.
Maybe we should invite Professor Rune Wigblad, because he wrote an article about the magnetic train in the Swedish engineering newspaper Ny Teknik the other day.
Yeah, I think he put up his hand. So, Mr. Wigblad, you're more than welcome to make some remarks.
But
thank you.
Thank
you for the word. On the point of population density, it's very clear if you look at modern geographic maps that the population density is very strong in the central cities of Oslo, Stockholm, and Copenhagen and Gothenburg, compared to population density down Europe, where the density is more spread out. Of course, Holland is high density, but if you only look at the cities, centers, the density is very high in Scandinavia. And that makes it even more important to connect these city centers with each other. And if we could do that, we could create, like, as Alf hinted on, 8 million inhabitants, which would be a substantial influence in Europe, of course, and it would create a very new economic dynamic in the Nordic countries, for sure. But then you have to agree on that over the borders, of course. And the second question raised by Askari was concerning what's happening on the tracks between these hubs or big cities. Then we must take into consideration that the maglev trains have 4 times as good acceleration capacity as ordinary rails. So they can reach top speed very fast, and that creates very good opportunity for communities and cities which are located close to the track between. So I think it's a very good opportunity, and I also think that Alf made a very good point when it comes to the we can both bypass these cities, and we can have a track which enters the city. Both I think it's a very good idea, and so I think that what's also interesting with maglev is that the track construction of the tracks are like 1/4 of concrete compared to if you want a high-speed rail on elevated bridge. So the bridges for the maglev trains are very thin, if you like, or it's a lightweight construction, which makes it very important to jump to this technology when it has matured. And now it is maturing very fast in China. So within a few years from now, we will have a lot of experience from these maglev tracks in China. Thank you for the word. Thank you.
Thank you. No, well, I think that's it's a very important point, because many of the discussions that have come up in some contexts that I've observed or heard between discussions in Sweden is they tend to think of it only as an issue of building between, for example, Malmö and Stockholm, and maybe Gothenburg. But the point is, if you are looking, number one, at these structures as a transport connectivity between the Nordic countries and actually China, you have a totally different idea of what the import and the relative productivity of building these would be in terms of population centers. But the narrowness of thinking, which would tend to come up in some of these discussions among bureaucrats I've heard in Sweden, is, well, why should we, build a fast train between these Swedish cities or such? So I think that's a very important concept, that this is connected to not only to the major population cities, centers in Scandinavia, but as a transport connectivity to as well to Asia and to China, and that's the future. And the fight is to begin to raise that vision with more people, because that will enable business communities to understand the importance of joining in these efforts. Just on the...
Can I interrupt?
We
have now the scientific experience of the Öresund Bridge. It's connected Malmö with Copenhagen. And it's very positive. The payback time is in if you make a rough scientific investigation, which has been made, it's like 12 years or something. But the payback is actually even shorter than this in reality. So the dynamics from this interconnection of these two cities is very apparent in Sweden and Denmark. And you can imagine if we connect Gothenburg and Copenhagen and Gothenburg-Malmö with the same time distance as the Öresund Bridge takes for commuting, then it would be similar dynamics, economic dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I don't know if there's, yes, Mr. Johansen?
Yeah, just one comment, because I think there have been many people that has addressed this issue about economics, especially your colleague talking about Oskari talking about the economic system, how it works today. I think it's very important to see that the payback of the investment in infrastructure is almost immediately. You know, you cannot only think traditionally how to get the amortization of the loan, etc., etc. For example, the state they get taxation from the work, from the jobs. They get value-added taxes. There is a lot of side effects, spin-off effects of these kind of projects. But even if you look away from that and only look at the investment costs and the amortization, the market is so big that even if with the 2 crowns per passenger kilometer, then you will get your payback, and this will be a very profitable project, and that's a pretty low price. And I've seen the prices on the Sapsan, for example, in Russia. I mean, they pay like $400, I think, from Moscow to St. Petersburg, and the highest price tickets is $1,000 per ticket from Moscow to St. Petersburg. So and the trains are full all the time. So because there is a demand, there is a market for the fast train travels, but because we don't have it, we don't know about it in the Nordic region. So I think there will be payback to the investors, but even more payback to the states and to the regions and to the local cities and towns. When it comes to job creation and etc., etc.
I think that's a very good point. Do you want to respond to that, Mr. Oskari?
Yes, what I discussed this morning is that we have a systemic problem, is that the so-called market is not interested in production and increasing the living conditions of the population. They are only interested in profit in a short term. That's why we cannot find financing in the private market for anything. Then they are suggesting public-private partnership, which means that actually the taxpayers will pay most of it and the private companies will get the profit. We have a cultural problem in the business world. I have personal experience. I tried to introduce some projects in Southwest Asia or the Middle East to companies from Japan and Europe. And I met with the 2 CEOs of very, very large industrial companies because they would benefit a lot as a side effect of if they invest in these projects, they will get much more business in that country. So with the CEO, we had the finance officer, who's like a 20-year-old guy sitting next to us. And I made a presentation, and the CEO, who's an engineer, he said, "This is fantastic project. This is definitely something we can do. We would be happy to do it." But then at the end of the meeting, he turned to the young boy, who's the financial officer of the company, and he said, "What do you think?" And the boy said, "No, we're not going to finance this." So what I learned later is that all the major industrial companies in Europe and China and Japan, like ABB, like Siemens, like Mitsui, their financial branch, the company has an engineering branch, they produce machines and stuff, and then they have a financial branch. They put all their profits in the financial branch, and what the financial branch people do is they take that money and speculate with it in the financial markets, because they can make very, very big profits very, very quick. Instead of waiting 5 years for an infrastructure project to give profit, they can make profits every day. So the financial sector in every company, in the whole culture, is so corrupt, is that they think if you can make money from speculating on the dollar every day, you don't need to build highway speedway. You don't need to build bridges. You don't need to have agricultural land. So there is a cultural corruption in the so-called market economies. That's why we are unable to find financing. It takes years of discussions in the parliaments and the government and the municipalities to get some money for a small project. But to get money for a huge banking, bailout, it takes less than 1 day. The Central Bank of Sweden in 2008 took a decision without consulting with the government to pump 400 billion kroner to the Swedish banks. They did it again now in May. In the United States, they can pump trillions of dollars overnight without asking the Congress or the American president. But to finance an infrastructure project, it takes many months and sometimes years to have the financing. So that's the problem with the so-called private market today. And I have a personal experience of that.
Thank you. I mean, it has obviously a lot to do with what is your motivation in investment, because if you are satisfied with a long-term investment, which is going to produce a massive increase in productivity and employment, but will necessarily be maybe 10, 20, 30, 40 years, it will give you a growth rate of perhaps in the best 5 to 10%, but not these kinds of speculative money market profits which motivate the present financial structures. And that is really one of the fundamental difficulties, which is often not addressed. Because if you don't understand, this is what I was speaking about in the beginning when I said we have to understand certain scientific principles about economy. Because if you have a credit system which is directed towards productive investment and does not allow speculation in that way, which, for example, President Roosevelt, when he came in and fought Wall Street, he immediately implemented what was called the Glass-Steagall, the law which separated commercial banking from investment or speculative banking. And that's the kind of thing that should be done now. There should be a general cleaning of the financial structures in the world, or especially in the West, where this is not, China does not have this problem right now, because when the Glass-Steagall law was taken away by President Clinton in 1999, that was the very point where China implemented a kind of banking separation which was designed more or less to focus on productive investment and not speculative investment, making that separation. And that is a necessary, unavoidable step that needs to be raised and understood if we are going to be able to create these financial mechanisms which we need to make all these projects become realized. So I think Professor Wigblad had something more to say. You're muted.
Well, I don't know if I can comment on the long-termism, and of course it's very obvious to see that Sweden is very short-term long-termist thinking when it comes to the construction of the high-speed rail. It could be like 2/3 of the East Link ready 10 years from now. That is like 150 kilometers. That's very slow. And China is building very fast and very decisive and thinking long-term, which is not the situation in Sweden. So I think, to my mind, it's about budgeting in the state budgeting, which is focused on next year, and the investment budgeting is not separated from the ordinary budgeting. So infrastructure investments are competing with all the other things, you know, building, healthcare, you know, all these things are they competing with in the ordinary budget, which has created a situation in Sweden where the public investments have fallen, yeah, well, down to the level of 1940 or something. It's a very, very sad situation, I think. But I think there are some actors in the Nordic context which are more long-term. Perhaps the Norwegian oil funds, Alf.
I can comment on that. The problem is that Norway and also, of course, other countries, but especially maybe Norway, we have plenty of cash and available funds, but they are not accessible for the good infrastructure projects, to be honest, or they even sometimes are used for bad infrastructure projects that are not given, they're not effective. But I think the problem is the state budgeting system that is so broken up in bits and pieces. I mean, that when they make their long-term plans, it's only a range of small projects. It's nothing really comprehensive and long-term. That's why it's very difficult to believe that the state will ever make a project like the Trans-Nordic railway system happen. And then Oskar, totally agree with you that there is a kind of you may call it corruption or whatever, or culture within the financial sector that is so that it's also very difficult to get financing of infrastructure, which is very good for people, but and good for climate and good for regional development and good for a lot of things, peace and cooperation. But that's not important for these guys, and they are thinking too much in the how to speculate with money, instead of investing it in good values. So my question is more how to come around it. Is there any possibility to find a new model where we can get, if we don't get money from the financial institutions, then maybe people can fund? Is it possible to think crowdfunding? Is it possible to think a combination of maybe local government, crowdfunding, maybe some entrepreneurial businesses, etc. And there are also maybe some private investors who could be maybe go into it if they are not from the financial sector but from the industry. So is it possible to find a model that would be nice, where we could access big money? Because if you have a project that is estimated to be very profitable, then you will get your money back. So basically the customers are just handing you the money up front somehow. because anyway, these railways are so self-financing that they could be funded by the customers or by the people. But I'm not an expert on this, but we have to figure out how to come around it.
It's a very good question, and I want to give Mr. Askari, since he's been addressing this, the chance to answer it, and then it will probably come back again in further discussion. However, I want to welcome Miss Isabelle Hannouche, who will be speaking to us. I will let Mr. Askari respond to Alf, and then I will welcome you, Miss Isabelle, to make some comments, and you make your presentation, and I will introduce you.
Okay, I think Ulf also has something to say to that, but I think we don't need to reinvent the wheel. You know, we know what worked before, we know what works now. What worked before for the United States, Europe, and Sweden is what we call capital budgeting, where you have a separate budget for capital investments, which is usually the responsibility of the state. And then you have a current budget for the running costs of society. So you never mix these two. We have, in Sweden's history, we use the pension funds to build highways, build nuclear power plants, housing. That worked. So some people say this is old-fashioned. Why is it old-fashioned? It worked. It works now in China. Credit is directed as a separate thing for infrastructure investments in scientific and technological advances. So we have no doubt about what really worked. The only problem is that we have to change in the culture. And that's why I said we need a new international Bretton Woods meeting where nations can meet together and say, look, we have a failed system and a successful system. We know what worked before, we know what works now, we know what doesn't work. And therefore we need to come to an agreement in order to be able to develop. And even inside each country, we need to rethink the last 30 years of doing business and economics. So I think Ulf can add to that.
Okay, I will let Mr. Sandmark come back to that, but I want to first allow our next speaker who has joined us, Madam Isabelle Hannouche, the Managing Director from Teranga Trade, Shanghai, who will speak on unity and creating a future together. She has a group of entrepreneurs who are discussing and working on projects to how to enhance cooperation, and especially with China and Africa. And I want to give her the word, and then we will come back to this discussion, which I'm sure will continue, and Mr. Sandmark can bring us his remarks. But Isabelle, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for offering me the floor. And I would love first to say thank you to Stefan and Hussein to supporting our initiative in Shanghai. We had the chance to have Mr. Askari last week, 2 weeks ago, as a speaker to our Africa, China, and BRI event. So that was very insightful. My name is Isabelle Hannouche. I come from Senegal. I have quite an international background because I grew up in Senegal, in Africa. Then I did my university in Europe, in France. Then I've been living 8 years actually in Europe. And then I moved to China to start my entrepreneurial journey. And I've been living in China since. Yeah. Currently, I'm a bit locked down in Senegal. I cannot go back to China, but we stay very active. So my first company that, as you said, that is the Teranga Trade. So I'm basically helping my clients to buy in China. And I've been seeing this evolution with the BRI, that people are much more motivated about China, are very motivated as well to grow projects. And it has been a very big boost for the entrepreneurs And on the financial part, I think if I can share something about what Xi Jinping said, like it was in 2018, he offered credit possibilities for up to 60 billion USD for Africa-China cooperation. So it also gave to the African continent some, let's say, initiative that they would be able to, make projects with China. And we can see as entrepreneurs and as in the youth community of new entrepreneurs, let's say, that this is a big project. This is a very interesting idea, but we also notice that we don't really know how you grab those investment funds. So that's why we decided to do the Africa-China events that are actually open to anyone from any nationality, but that have projects with Africa within maybe the BRI frame. And we try to unlock a bit about those kind of secrets, like how to access those financement, how to build up projects that will be benefiting the continent and that will be sustainable, for example, and that will as well benefit really the African continent. And I've noticed with also my client coming from Europe that we have a lot of complementarities, because there is some views from Europe that are very interesting in how to do the trading business now. And I can see as well with my clients from Africa that they always look on both sides. They will ask me, for example, for the prices in China, and they will as well look what's going on in Europe. So they will always balance both to make their decisions, their buying decisions. So I think now the world is really global. There is interest in both buying from China or from Europe or even from the United States. We need more cooperation, because I think people want to develop their enterprise, they want to develop their country. So they are also looking for this kind of cooperation in the financing their project, to make it kind of a better world. And that's why we come together in our events, and we try to put this perspective. And fortunately in Shanghai, there is quite an international community of entrepreneurs, Europeans, Americans, Africans, even local Chinese entrepreneurs that are quite international and have experience everywhere. So we come together and we try to see what is as well the position, the place of the youth and the people who want to make things moving forward, and that are looking for a more united community and with common interest of the development of the world as a whole, that people go beyond the difference, and that we can make a difference and happily live together. So it seems maybe a bit too positive, but when I am discussing this in Shanghai with our community and we have weekly events, I can see that most of the people that are joining also share this idea. So why not trying to also create this path for us, a new way of thinking, a new cooperation way. And that's where the BRI came in, and that is also united people. And now we also started, after the event we had with Mr. Askari, we started a group for cultural exchange. It's also the same, because to do trade together, we also need to understand each other. So there is a big work that we are doing behind for making this happen. But today I'm happy to be here to give a little of a positive note, and as well letting you know, guys, about our aspiration. And we are very glad to work with BRIX, with Mr. Askari, Mr. Brouwer, and thank you very much for offering us the opportunity to tell a little words about our initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabelle. I just want to mention, you do have this Teranga Valley program that you more or less have almost weekly, where you have young people. That's one element that we didn't directly take up, but I think it's a highly important part of the contribution to how we will go forward, because when young people engage in these types of projects and dialogue, that will lay the foundation for the type of future that we want to create. So I thank you for that. I hope that we will be able to work with you and cooperate not only today, but into the future on the work you are doing. And we appreciate your participation today. Maybe you have some others who are with us from your group who are with us, although I don't know if I've seen anyone directly right now that you know, but they're most welcome.
Thank you so much.
I think we can maybe perhaps have Mr. Sandmark, if he wanted to make remarks on the question that was addressed by Mr. Johansen, on which was also partly answered by Mr. Askari, but please, Mr. Sandmark.
Yes, thank you. Well, there is money around. It's just flowing tremendously from the central banks in this quantitative easing by the billions and by the trillions. So there is tremendous amounts of money now put into the more to save the banks than to save the industry in this corona crisis packages they put out. So actually what we need is to put this money into a security in real investment. That's the way to make them secure for the future, and to also create the productivity and the factor productivity what Hussein spoke about. So the thing is that these could be floated into National Development Bank under the Treasury. So in this way, the Treasury could put up a special section. We have in Sweden the so-called Riksgäld that is managing the debt of the Swedish state. This institution could be a bank for development, and they can then issue credits for these kind of projects like we did before with actually the pension funds was used basically as national planning institutions to plan the Swedish economy and build the infrastructure. So that's why I pointed to this sum of 140 billion crowns. This is the amount of money that they want to have invested for only the cargo traffic rail investments, and this is up to 2050. So this 140 billion Swedish crowns is very little compared to the thousands or billion that goes now to the banks for the bailouts and in these packages. So there is the money, but why is it possible now? Well, first of all, there are now corona packages putting forward. We have the great opportunity now to ask for real development, and it's in this kind of situation we have that we can ask for these kind of projects. And we also have now in Sweden 600,000 unemployed, and it's increasing rapidly. We probably need 1 million new jobs here, and in the world 1.5 billion new productive jobs. So we need to put the unemployed and the youth into work, and this has to be worked as a big project. And then when it comes to politics, I'm quite impressed with what Daniel and Ulf is involved in the development of the corridor up in the north. When we saw a seminar here in Stockholm about it, we learned a lot how they have developed now a cross-border development corridor with political backup, and in this way they involve the neighbor countries in the development. And that's why I think it's so important to raise the whole issue to the Nordic Council, to the Nordic cooperation, and have the prime ministers of Scandinavia meet and discuss what should be the response to the corona package. to the Corona crisis and develop a big package for development. So I think now we can lift the whole thing over the bureaucrats that have been blocking the development for so long with such a kind of meeting. We had our financial crisis here in Sweden in the 90s, and this crisis was, there were special commissions led by a guy called it was called the Dennis package. And this Bengt Dennis, he was a banker, and he was putting forward big infrastructure projects at that time. So it's just in this kind of situations we can have a new situation for the investments. So I think we should really push for this cross-border cooperation, and in this way lift it, just like they do it with this corridor up in Umeå, and which Daniel and Ulf is involved in.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that makes a certain point clear, although not necessarily easily achieved, that the question of credit, or what is being done right now, is it's not the problem of money as such. The problem is where the money or the credit is going. And right now it is the priority of the central banks to save their neck and save the speculation. And that's why quantitative easing is functioning at an extremely low interest rate, because if they don't get that liquidity, there will be, as has been warned by many financial experts, I'm not sure if Michela Jirachi is still with us, but he might have some remarks he might want to make on that. But the point is that that it's a question of principle. How do we go back, not reinventing the wheel? It's already been done, but how do we implement the policies which will ensure that the credit goes to the proper places? Right now it is not. And obviously there are certain interests that prefer it not to go to the type of projects that we're talking about. So that will involve a certain determination and endurance, and even a certain amount of courage on the part of the individuals, and hopefully all here, to engage themselves in that dialogue and engage themselves in that process to bring those questions to bear on the political front as well as other fronts. But I think that this is the proper forum. We expand, we educate, we make people understand these questions, and then that gives them, empowers them to respond in the proper way. We have a certain amount of time remaining. I wanted to make some remarks which perhaps go back briefly, not long remarks, but some 10 minutes perhaps, regarding both some of the points that I made, that I introduced at the beginning when I said that we will implies understanding certain economic principles, that supporting the question of the BRI does involve understanding these principles. And I think my colleague, Mr. Askari, made an excellent initiative in presenting the foundation for how those principles should work. The challenge, one of the challenges right now is there have been in history, clearly in my country, from the beginning, the United States, we are raised on the idea of the US Declaration of Independence, which begins by all men and women or humans are created equal. with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It did not say all humans, men and women, except for blacks, are created equal. That kind of refusal in history to understand and act on principles which the leading intellects and thinkers in history have given us as gifts for mankind's development, that's the type of issue that we have to take on. It's a similar question with the BRI. The point of the president of China in initiating the BRI is a shared community for the future of mankind. It's not only a question of, yes, it is a question of infrastructure, but it's the intention that the objective of the BRI, the potential for other nations to join, is based on a principle that it is in the interest of all people to allow this kind of development. We see, I think everybody is aware of the problem in the United States when this question has recently emerged around the murder of George Floyd, that despite all of the history and the fight against slavery and other things, the issue of equality has not been sufficiently acted on and implemented. But these principles that refer to the inalienable rights of human beings, a shared future for a community for the future of mankind, they define a direction for mankind's future, which are based on cooperation. They are based on win-win. They are not based on a zero-sum game, which says if I get rich, you have to suffer or become poor. And the BRI was created obviously not for China as an initiative for China alone, but it calls for global development, and it must involve all sovereign nations, including European nations, the United States, the international community of nations for cooperation. For if it's going to function properly, it will necessitate a new financial system based on these principles which Mr. Askari was pointing very clearly to. That is, agreements between nations that will operate on these scientific principles of increasing productive powers of labor. And if the nations of Russia, China, the United States, and generally India, or perhaps one could even consider the BRICS, not our BRICS, but the BRICS of Brazil, India, or Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, as a foundation for how to establish this kind of meeting that was initially intended by President Franklin Roosevelt at the end of the Second World War. And I think that is what we need now. We can work for cooperation and business opportunities. We should. That's important. But we have to recognize that these principles which we're talking about should not have ideological obstacles. And they should not be stopped due to ideological manipulations, which are presently being used as preventing the type of general cooperation we need. So I think that this means that the BRI can be seen as a kind of launching point for these new type of economic arrangements, a type of new Bretton Woods. And I think that I hope that, I know Chancellor Hahn is with us. Ambassador is not with us right now, but I think that beyond the issue of the importance of protecting the nation of China and its economic developments in light of the BRI, that it's very important to recognize this principle, which we have begun to identify here, as something for the world, especially China and leading nations. It's going to be a challenge without problems. As the Chinese say, that when you have a problem, you think of first of a challenge, and that will definitely be the case in the United States right now, because the political forces in the United States are not even close. The ones that are generally controlling policy are not yet close to recognizing the importance of this kind of initiative for a new Bretton Woods. But we work for that. I think that that new direction is the direction we need to take to come out of this COVID-19 pandemic. And it was just like, in that sense, what the old Bretton Woods was intended at the end of the last war, when Franklin Roosevelt, and this is not common knowledge. It is not common knowledge by any means in the United States today. So this kind of thing, which the presentation by my colleague will hopefully be put out in YouTube soon, and can help to identify this as an end to not only colonial and imperial economic policies, but an end to poverty, as China has demonstrated that by the end of this year, 2020, there will be an end to poverty. And we probably will have another webinar of the BRICS in the coming period in September, addressing that issue as a kind of collaboration which can go on between Sweden and China as a celebration to end poverty, not only in China, but everywhere. It is necessary to understand in this context, in order to build this kind of new Bretton Woods, in order for it to function, it is necessary to understand the difference between a monetarism or a money system and a financial system or a system that's solely based on the power of money, as opposed to a credit system, which is directing credit through national sovereignty and banking for the development and the general welfare of the people. That has to be clarified and understood more and more clearly as principles which will define the direction of not alone how we can go forward with the BRI, but how it will be more and more rapidly increased. So I could say, I think it might be enough. Enough said. I think that we are fighting to get out new knowledge, and we will continue that in light of supporting the BRI and bringing more and more people, businessmen in Sweden. I hope that this seminar or this webinar will engage more businesses and companies, so that perhaps the next time we will have to increase the number of maximum viewers from 100 to 500, and maybe even more than that going down the road. That's what we should have as an objective. So I'm hoping that this has been a very positive webinar, a productive one, and an informative one for everyone in gaining a a clear vision of how we can go forward with the BRI and with a development perspective for global development, despite the negativity that we see around us. It does demand courage and determination on our own parts. But, you know, there's a saying, I haven't expressed it. My wife is an African. She's from Uganda. My children are active right now in this fight around what has happened to George Floyd in the United States. But there is a certain principle that was used: we shall overcome. And that kind of thinking is the direction we need as a kind of global movement to make sure that this challenge to eliminate poverty and unite people will succeed. So I want to thank you, and we can continue perhaps with some, we have some time. There might be further elaborations or questions that people want to make. Is there?
Steve,
okay.
I have something there.
All right, Mr. Sandmark.
There is the question now, when you speak about mobilization all over the world, I think there is the question of who should do it, because actually that's why I'm very happy that Isabelle was here and telling about her projects and things like that, because what we see now in Sweden, when we are about to build this infrastructure, we don't have the labor power. We don't have the people that can do it if we are going for a big project. So that means that we have to train young people to get into construction, and they probably have to be trained from scratch. And this has to be done in the kind of way what Isabelle is speaking about, I think, because we have to do it in the creative way, in the innovative way. We have to do it in such a way that we invite the young people to projects on the highest innovative levels. So they train themselves and develop the technologies, and they can also recruit. And therefore, I think it's very important what Isabelle is doing, because this will be important to inspire the people here in the Nordic countries also to bring young people into these kind of projects. And then this will be an exchange then, because then they can be trained enough to take part in the projects if we do them as model projects for if we develop our infrastructure here in projects, we set up organizations, we set up companies for construction, we can take jobs and projects in the Africa, in the developing world to fight the corona crisis and to create this global health Silk Road and to create the BRI project. So we need to put so many young people into work into this, and I think what you are doing here is could inspire people here in Sweden, in our part of the world, to start to recruit themselves into these kind of projects, and then to start to work in cooperation to develop all the potentials of this tremendous young labor force in Africa and Iberia America and West Asia. These are young generations, and we have to see that they have a future, and we will have to work with them because they are the ones who must be part of the solution. That's the only way we can do it. So thank you, Isabelle.
Thank you, Mr. Sandmark. Really appreciate that you highlighted those things that are really important for us. And this is exactly that. We want to be part of the solution. But to be part of the solution, we also need to have the opportunity to learn about the initiative, to have the opportunity as well to attend this kind of events that you are doing here at BRIX. Because sometimes the youth is just thinking like defeat, like we are already defeated. Like, okay, anyway, we cannot change anything. Anyway, we cannot impact anything. So that's why we create those events. So the experts like Mr. Askari come and he highlight, no, there is solutions. There are things we can do, even in our scale. And then it just awaken people and make them aware that if they want to impact, there is ways. And those are the ways. Because sometimes I think most of the youth from everywhere, we want to impact our world. We want to do something, but we just don't know where to start. And sometimes what we see on TV, on news, or what we hear is very negative. So we think that we must not take this road. But actually, by doing our events, they come, they learn, because that is the first step that we are doing, is learning. We learn on what it is really, not only the little highlights that we hear here and there, like what is it clearly, so we can understand it. Then our second step is, okay, now how can we make an impact at any level? There is no too small, like everyone has started somewhere. And actually, if we start now as young people, we will go so much far, right? So that is the kind of positivity we want to bring. And we want also to be the change that we want to see, because we want people to be united. So let's work together. Let's make a community that is open, that everyone can bring what they have, like the experience, wherever they are in their learning curve. And we can also bring speakers. We can also learn from people who are attending the events in whatever section they are. Like, it's not only focused on trade. That's why we do those events of education. It can be even in a cultural aspect, sports, etc. Like that, people feel free to make an impact today, like to move forward. So yes, I believe also by being in this event, I can learn from you. And I can also bring it to our community, so they can also learn and use it in their own way. That is, there is no right or wrong. We need just to be in action. That is what matters to me.
Thank you, Isabelle. Other comments or questions?
Yeah, just to answer that, I think it's also, your projects has to be brought up also to the government level. I mean, the government should be involved in a huge project for developing the labor power of the young people, both through education and on-the-job training. And that's why I put in my presentation the picture of the CCC. It was a program by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the Depression to put young people to work training. Very simple project. First, many projects about the nature to develop parks and other kinds of more easy projects, but then more and more complicated projects, and they were on the job training at the same time and also educated. So they became then the core of the labor force in the 40s and 50s for the United States. So this kind of projects has to be set up by the governments also as part of a discussion among the Nordic nations, but also in the European Union and others to recruit the young people into these productive jobs that can get the good payment and to get a good future, where they can also have this commercial innovative activities to start their own life and business.
Thank you. For the moment, we're not really on the government side, just because we just wanted people to not just wait for government to give proposals, that we can also learn and have proposals, and eventually the people joining later, maybe they can approach their governments and they can make something moving. So the first step that we are in is more about like, educating, open the mind, and making it possible that people want to make a movement and action. But yes, I agree. Maybe those people later on will be those who will influence their own governments, maybe.
Thank you. Mr. Askari, will you?
Yeah, no, just in conclusion, I would like to say that this has been a very inspiring webinar, and I have learned a lot. I thank our friends from the logistics and transport expert area. I have learned a lot about Sweden and the potentials also for the whole North. I mean, we in the Belt and Road Institute, we will continue to produce this kind of informative material, but also we become a meeting point for people who are interested in positively looking at collaboration among nations here in the North, but also with China and other nations. And we, like in only 1 year since we have created the Belt and Road Institute, we have become an institution here in Sweden, and we are very happy for that. We need to strengthen this relationship between the business community, with the local communities, but also with the government and other political institutions, because they really in bad need for objective and positive information about how important the Belt and Road is and collaboration with China, because they are being drowned with a lot of disinformation and negative views that are not really based on any scientific or a true historical view of things. So that's something we will continue to do, and also continue with these kinds of events. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Askari. I was just seeing Mr. Ulf Andersson. Did you have any remarks you would like to make before we begin to reach the closing? We obviously if you are there, I think you just entered again, if I'm correct. Mr. Andersson? Okay, he had admitted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we hear you.
Okay. Sorry it took a little bit longer than I expected. Anyhow, I've learned a lot from this webinar, and I found it very fascinating to see what's happening throughout Europe, Middle East, all the way over to China. And I thought it was a great experience, and I think we can learn a lot from this.
Thank you for that. We're very happy that you were with us, and I'm sure we will be happy to have you in the future to join us when we continue with the webinar in the coming period. Mr. Salani.
I think Councillor Hahn had wanted to say something.
Yeah, Councillor, please.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I suppose it's approaching the end of this webinar.
Yes.
So I will, on behalf of the Chinese Embassy, to thank BRIX for this very good initiative to organize today's webinar, and also special thanks goes to Stephen for your excellent job to moderate the whole day program. And also from the embassy, we are willing to continue our good cooperation with the BRICS. And also, as we know that under this current circumstance, we are all fighting against COVID-19, and also this means we need to cooperation, more deepened cooperation. And also it's the same in the field of BRI. We do also need cooperation between the nations, between the peoples, between the business communities. So we wish to continue to work with you, and also I will thank all the speakers for your very interesting and also informative presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Hahn. Thank you very much. And I wish to thank all of the ambassadors who were involved and contributing. I also wish to thank former Undersecretary Michela Jirachi. Maybe I think he had admitted himself earlier this afternoon, but I don't know if he's still with us. He might, if he is, I would welcome him to make some remarks before we close the webinar. perhaps he's not able to have been with us anymore. Then, if there is no final input or remarks or comments, see, we have only 10 minutes before the actual closing time. But if there's nothing more, I just will thank everyone for a very informative and very inspiring webinar. I'm very happy that everyone could be a part of it. I look forward to further collaboration with all of our speakers and guests, especially Isabelle. I think the young people gaining knowledge is the key for our success. So it's very important that you join us and we continue to collaborate together. And everyone, I want to thank you for being with us. And we look forward to having you join us again in the coming periods ahead.